My name is Olivia Grace Montgomery. I am 33 years old, and I live in a small, rain-softened row house in southeast Portland, Oregon. I teach 10th grade English at a public high school that smells like stale coffee and glue at the start of every semester. On my days off I write short essays, half-formed poems, and the sort of confessions I never intended to print. Right now my life feels like a stack of weathered postcards, familiar edges, images I've seen before, and one card that keeps coming up with a crease I can't smooth. I am someone who learned early how to be grateful for things that were given to her, for the steady roof, for a mother who showed up at every recital, for a name on a legal document. I was raised to measure my worth by what I had been spared. And yet, sometimes what you have been spared is the capacity to see yourself whole. Before I dive in, if you're into real stories that hit deep, please consider subscribing. Sharing this isn't easy for me, but maybe someone out there needs to hear it. The sentence that tethered me to the idea that my place was fixed and owed was the one my adoptive mother said more than once, in the same flat, admonishing tone that smelled faintly of lemon-scented cleaner. You should be grateful to be chosen. She said it like a fact. As if gratitude could be an antidote for curiosity, for questions, or for the particular ache that sits behind the sternum when you're asked to love without knowing the origin of the love you receive. I was found, they told me, at 2 days old. There was a pamphlet in the adoption agency folder, a paper fold-out with glossy smiles and a note that a family had been approved. My mother, June Montgomery, wrote me an adoption story in that neat, confident hand she still kept in a spiral-bound planner. They had been preparing for a child. They had wanted me. I had been chosen. That choice, in their telling, was a sacred thing. The house where I grew up smelled like cinnamon in the winter and lemon in the spring. There were framed photos of my first birthday and a kindergarten snapshot where my hair stuck up like a rooster's comb. The pictures sit now on the mantel at my mother's house, faces frozen in seasons I have lived in. Memory is not an uninterrupted film but a series of intensely lit frames. One of the earliest is a gray morning, my mom's hand wrapped in mine as we walked along the Cleveland Clinic campus for the appointment that decided whether our baby me would be healthy enough for discharge. The sound of her heels on the hospital tile is a rhythm I can still mimic. She hummed when she was nervous. That day she hummed and told the admissions nurse, "She's perfect." The nurse laughed and said, "We don't use that word," but she did it anyway, the word that both flattened me and warmed me. Perfect. Someone had chosen me and pronounced me acceptable. Growing up, the cultural script for adopted children in our neighborhood was simple. Say thank you. Say you were lucky. My mother coached me in it. At PTA meetings she would lean over to other parents with an expression that mixed pride and proprietorship. We were so blessed to be chosen. I learned to answer, yes, I'm grateful, because it was easy and because not answering felt like refusing the affection that had kept me fed, clothed, and safe. Gratitude became the public face of loyalty. But gratitude is a poor substitute for identity. It's a tidy bow over the messy fact of not knowing. As a kid I would press my ear against the back of the closet where photo albums were kept and listen for any sound that suggested more. A letter, a name, a loss. The house had its own smell, vanilla candles and the faint tang of my mother's hairspray. Yet sometimes at night, there would be another smell drifting in from the attic, like cedar and old paper, and my skin would prickle with a question I couldn't form into words. Adolescence sharpened those edges. I was 12 when I first asked June the direct question, "Who is my real mother?" and was met with an expression that was both practiced and bruised. She closed the kitchen drawer where she kept the caramel-colored wooden rosary her mother had given her and said, "Olivia, you were given to us. Being chosen is rare. You should be grateful. I am your mother." Her voice was soft but final, like closing a door without turning the knob. That finality stung. I became adept at hiding this sting in school essays about belonging, in the rhythms of my day. Preparing lesson plans, grading essays with a red pen, drinking black coffee while rain slid down the window. Things that required the outward application of steady, calm hands allowed me to tamp down questions that could unsettle the house. Gratitude and civility made the household function. The family looked like a snapshot of normalcy. We were the couple that had adopted a child and were active in the community. I was the daughter who made them proud. Then there were other things, smaller, more dangerous vulnerabilities, that seemed into the fabric of our life. My younger brother, Luke, biological child of June, and my adoptive father, David, could be warm and then turn suddenly volatile. He would slam doors and call me ungrateful behind the hum of a dishwasher, saying things like, "You don't know how lucky you are." His voice always had the tremor of someone who associated gratitude with owed silence. The family ritual around Thanksgiving and birthdays felt like a battlefield where my feelings were always the last to be negotiated. I learned to couch my questions in gratitude so they wouldn't set off the mines. At 17, when the need for answers pressed at me like a physical hunger, I started searching more actively. There was no internet-based DNA testing in our house then. Searching meant the slow invention of sliver tools, whispered conversations with my mom's sister at family reunions, the peculiar glances across the dinner table, the way old friends of my parents would clink their drinks and say, "You were a lucky girl," as if luck could explain absence. The first real break in the surface came the summer before college when I climbed into the attic after hearing a sound like a page turning above me. There, behind trunks and a trunk of old coats, I found a shoebox labeled in my mother's hand, "Letters." I sat on the attic floor and opened it. The letters were not addressed to June. They were letters to me. To baby Olivia. The first one smelled of smoke, old smoke, and sun-faded ink. The handwriting was different from my mother's neat slant, looping and hurried. The envelope bore a different city postmark, a city I knew as part of my mother's past, Youngstown. The handwriting said, "Please know I wanted you. Please stay safe." I remember how my thumb traced the line on the paper until my chest felt hollow. I slept downstairs that night, the box at the foot of my bed like an accusation. When I showed June, she did not take the letter as a doorway to conversation. She took it as a threat. "That's private," she said, and her face turned white, a string of muscles pulling tight. "You weren't even supposed to see that." She said it like a sentence that would solve a math problem. "You should be grateful to be here." Her hands reached for the paper with an urgency that had something like fear or shame in it. I learned then that gratitude wasn't an invitation to ask. It was a closure, a tool of containment. The discovery of those letters made the house unfamiliar. I imagined the woman who had written them, someone who had used the same words I used now in my head, and I felt a complex sorrow, not only for what I didn't know, but for what my mother's possessiveness might have taken from me. I wanted to meet the woman who had chosen and then had to let me go. I wanted to know the color of her hair, the cadence of her laugh. I wanted to know if she had gone on to build a life that included me in its margins, or if she had been erased by the weight of my mother's quiet insistence. If this is resonating with you so far, a like really helps us reach more people. The attic box started something in me that couldn't be put back in place. It made me read the photographs on the walls differently. It made June's grammar school pictures look like evidence. And it made the phrase, "You should be grateful," sound less like a lesson and more like a command that silenced me. There is a peculiar violence in being asked to be grateful for an identity that feels half-formed. Gratitude, wielded like a weapon, can keep you tethered to someone else's version of your life. That's the truth I started to live with as I packed for college 3 years later. Books, clothes, the attic shoebox folded into a shoebox of its own. The house smelled like a storm that was always on the horizon. The transit of packing felt like a small exodus. My mother hugged me at the front door, her voice steady, and she said, "Remember where you came from." It was a phrase heavy with hope and ownership. When I moved away, I held my own hand in ways a child cannot. Being far from the house allowed a certain freedom. Late-night research at the university library. The first time I typed "Anonymous Mother Adoption Ohio 1990" into a microfiche index. I started keeping a journal titled, "What I Am Allowed to Know," a private litany I never showed anyone. I sketched out the idea of using a DNA test the way other people plan vacations. Cautious, hopeful, and simultaneously terrified of breaking something delicate. Each time I imagined confronting June with what I'd found or what I intended to find, I could hear her voice admonishing me, and in that voice I felt both safety and a lock. The moment that would ultimately shift the current of my life wasn't a confrontation but a quiet decision. One winter night, 3 months before my 33rd birthday, After years of small, hesitant inquiries and after a lifetime of being told gratitude should be my dominant feeling, I opened a browser and ordered a DNA kit. My fingers trembled as I clicked, purchase. And for the first time in a long while, there was a thrill to the uncertainty. The kit arrived in a small white box that smelled faintly of cardboard. It felt like a small rebellion. I had no idea then how much of me would be rewritten by the answers that came back. I remember the day I swallowed the cotton swab like taking a bitter pill. Slow and with the deliberate calm of someone trying not to make a sound in a room full of sleeping things. The instructions were straightforward, clinical. Rub the swab inside your cheek for 30 seconds. My kitchen was bright with winter light, the small space smelling of coffee and lemon oil. I thought of June's hands, the way she used to smooth the hair behind my ear in public so people would see us as a unit. There was a small tremor in my chest, part adrenaline, part grief, and when I sealed the tube and dropped it into the mailbox, the world felt like a place where something dangerous and liberating had begun. Waiting for results is its own kind of slow-burning anxiety. It becomes a background hum, or in my case, a soundtrack of old songs and new questions. I lectured my students daily about the magic of names in literature, how a name can be a prophecy, and then went home and couldn't remember whether my own sounded like destiny or accident. I read everything about adoption I could find. Memoirs written in careful, triumphant arcs, forum posts that made me dizzy with the rawness of brightness and pain, and case studies that read like legal thrillers. Some people talked about reunion as an inevitable, tender closing of a circle. Others warned of ruptures, of people who had not spoken in years because contact opened the closet door and let out a skeleton no one wanted to see. Then the email arrived. Matches found, it read in the subject line. The body of the message was clinical, but my hands went cold and then hot. 3 people showed up as genetic relatives, partial matches, possible aunts or uncles, located in Ohio and Pennsylvania. One had the same crescent-shaped scar on the forearm as I had from a childhood fall. One used the same obscure phrase my mother used when she signed letters, with care. The most promising match had a last name I had never seen in our family photos, Hernandez. The discovery felt like the first hinge of a heavy door opening. It also felt terrifying. There were logistics to consider, how to make contact without seeming intrusive, how to protect people who had no obligation to invite me into their lives. I drafted a message like a contract, short, factual, and careful. Hello, my name is Olivia Montgomery. We may be related. I'm looking to learn more about my biological family. If you are open to speaking, I'd be grateful. If not, I understand. It was a message that tried to balance the impudence of the request with the humility of someone who had been told to always be grateful. When I sent the message, I expected nothing. What I received instead was an invitation to meet in person with a woman named Marta, the genetic match with the Hernandez last name. The meeting was scheduled at a small cafe on a rainy Friday. The cafe was the kind with mismatched chairs and music you could feel but not place. I remember the way the steam fogged the windows and turned the city into a watercolor. Marta looked older than me, maybe in her late 50s, with hair the color of the afternoon sky and a laugh that came easily. Her hands were calloused, the hands of someone who had worked with them. She said Olivia without surprise, like someone who had been expecting a name to fit a face all along. Our conversation was halting at first. She told me she had known a woman named Hannah, short, abrupt, with ink-stained fingers, who had lived in Youngstown and who, for a time, had worked at the steel plant. Hannah had left town when she was pregnant, Marta said, and there had been rumors, whispers of addiction and of men who did not stay. Marta said she had always suspected Hannah's child was placed somewhere through informal arrangements. Her voice carried a kind of sorrow that made me feel both closer and farther at the same time. She said, "You look like her in the mouth." She always joked that her laugh would get her in trouble. The more we spoke, the more Marta's story filled in like slow ink. Hannah's life had not been linear. She had been good at jokes, bad at staying, and ferociously protective in ways that sometimes didn't make sense until later. There was mention of a name, Rachel, in several of the conversations I had that week. Some people remembered Hannah and Rachel as a pair of friends who kept each other afloat, Others spoke of Rachel as a transient, someone who would appear and disappear. It was messy and human, the kind of messy that didn't yield to the clean grammar of legal adoption. When I asked the direct question, did anyone know where the baby went? Marta's face shifted. June, she said slowly, as if reciting a list of possible graves. June Montgomery. She came around. After. She had this kind of presence. Her eyes held mine with a mix of accusation and apology. She went on, there were people who didn't approve of Hannah's choices. She trusted the wrong ones. But she loved that child. Always said she'd come back. Hearing that someone had remembered Hannah loving me in the small ways they could became a kind of salve. It didn't make the years I had lived without her any less lost, but it gave me a thread to follow. I called my mother that night from a public phone because it felt less invasive than calling from my apartment. June answered with that steady voice. Everything okay? She said. I met someone who knew Hannah, I said. There was silence on the other end, a pause that felt like a re-evaluation. Olivia, she said finally, you shouldn't poke at things that aren't broken. She's my mother, I said, and the words tasted like both claim and apology. You have a mother who raised you, she returned. You should be grateful to be chosen. The line went quiet, and in that quiet I felt the small click of a mechanism sealing itself. The phrase was a defense tactic now, a wheel that turned to shut out the light. I didn't stop. Meeting Marta unearthed more names, and those names had addresses. The more I learned, the more I realized my mother had been in touch with people from Hannah's past. She had been present in the conversations long after Hannah had left town. There were postcards sent, messages intercepted, offers of help declined. It was like finding out that someone had been sketching a map in pencil and erased the relevant roads. The crucial detail that made my stomach drop was this. June had met Hannah in person, back in the early 90s, after Hannah had given me up. Someone had driven June to the hospital where Hannah had worked and introduced them. There were witnesses. Some had even seen them speak in a corridor. I remember the exact smell of the air that day. A wet winter breeze off the river as I stood outside my mother's house. I had the list of names pressed against my palm like talismans. I wanted to ask June, but I also hated that wanting. I wanted to demand the truth, and I wanted to preserve the comic relief of our small, tidy world. I walked into the kitchen where she was making her afternoon tea. June, I said, and the simplicity of my voice felt like a stake. She looked up, startled. Olivia, what's wrong? Did you meet Hannah? I asked. For a moment she didn't answer. Then she did, but the words were not what I expected. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? She stirred her tea slowly as if timing mattered. Because it would have complicated things, she said finally. Because I thought I was doing the right thing. The tension in my chest made my fingers go numb. Doing the right thing. You stopped me from meeting my mother. You kept letters hidden. Do you understand how that feels? Her face was an atlas of regret and fortitude. I was not the heroine in a story you think, she said. I was scared. I thought you would want certainty, stability. I thought. You thought you were protecting me. I thought I was protecting everyone. I could feel the steam rising from the mug between us. It smelled like chamomile and the kind of rationalizations I had heard all my life. Do you regret it? I asked. Her eyes were steady when she looked at me. For the first time, I saw the weary lines that weren't posed, weren't under makeup. Yes, she said simply. Sometimes. But it was said like a brief admission, not an apology. Her shoulders were the same ones that had held me as a child, but now they seemed to be folded inward, guarding something fragile. But Olivia, she added quickly, you should be grateful you were chosen. It was an old refrain with new teeth. I left her house that day with the world rearranged. I had anticipated anger, a spectacle that would have satisfied some cinematic urge, but instead I felt the cool, precise sorrow of someone who realized a person close to them had told lies that were neither grand nor dramatic but persistent and corrosive. It wasn't only deception, It was a pattern of small betrayals that accumulated like lichen on a stone. In the weeks that followed, I met more people. I learned that Hannah had fought, without success at first, against systems that treated her like a hazard. I learned that there had been a man, briefly in and out of scenes, who set things in motion that left Hannah isolated. I learned that June, though she had loved me, had been compelled by fear. Fear of scandal, fear of being judged by a village that prized neat stories over messy lives. And I learned that fear can be as violent as any deliberate cruelty. I booked a train back to Youngstown with a kind of solemnity that felt like a pilgrimage. The station smelled like oil and old metal, and the city greeted me with the cold breath of its industrial past. I went to the streets where Hannah had lived and worked. There was a laundromat whose bell tinkled with the same rhythm as the one my mother had insisted on when she wanted to attract a crowd's sympathy. I asked at corner stores, at diners, and people who had known Hannah turned their heads at the mention of her name. Some smiled like people who remember tragedies fondly, some scowled as if it might implicate them in the wrong, and there were those who simply refused to engage, as if any conversation about such things might drag them into a pool. At the edge of town I found a small, weathered house with a chipped mailbox. A woman came out, older than I'd expect, but with the same quickness in her step I had seen in Marta's face. She opened the door when I knocked and looked at me in a way that felt like recognition, like a photograph finally finding the right frame. "Olivia?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "I'm Olivia." She drew me in without ceremony and set a cup of coffee in front of me that tasted like forgiveness and bad news. "You look like her in the mouth," she said, and the words were both balm and blade. Our conversations spilled into hours. She had been a neighbor of Hannah's, watched her as one might watch a house once standing proud and then flinch in the wind. She told me about fights, about moments where Hannah seemed to wrestle with the kind of fierce love that made mistakes for the sake of shelter. She had preserved a box of Hannah's things, ribbons, a cigarette lighter, a photo of a girl with my eyes. In that photo Hannah was smiling like someone who had managed to make a decision she had promised to herself she would never regret. "I always thought she'd come back," the neighbor said quietly. "She told me once she wouldn't leave her child unless she knew they would be safe." Her voice trembled in the way that makes honesty painfully human. "We all thought someone would take her in. But then things happened. People made choices. The town presented me with options I hadn't anticipated. The possibility that the person who gave me away had been forced into a corner by circumstances beyond her control, and the possibility that my adoptive mother had been a person both capable of love and capable of silencing others for reasons that weren't entirely selfish. These were not mutually exclusive. Human beings often move within both spaces at once. That night on the train back to Portland, I stared at the dark window until my reflection blurred into the lights of the city I was returning to. The word chosen kept circling in my mind, a coin tossed into the air to see which face it landed on. I had not expected to find multiple truths. I had expected, perhaps naively, a singular villain and a singular victim. Life, I was learning, refused that simplicity. But my mother had made a choice to keep the story tidy. And in doing so she had not anticipated what she was losing. She had not anticipated that a quiet, steady daughter would one day push at a sealed seam, and that the seam would not hold. She had not imagined losing the chance to learn from the person she had raised about what loyalty looks like when it is reciprocal and honest. She had not imagined that gratitude could not be demanded like a debt, and that the person she had told to be grateful might one day choose learning over compliance. If this story is touching something inside you, feel free to share in the comments. I'm reading everything. Don't forget to subscribe if you want to hear how this ends. When I returned to Portland, the house felt both familiar and slightly foreign. The light through the blinds made patterns on the floor, and my mother's picture frames continued to watch over the living room with their staged smugness. I tried to carry the images of Youngstown with me like a secret talisman: Hannah's ribbon, Marta's laugh, the neighbor's quiet sorrow. But the real change was inside me, a rearrangement of priorities. I had discovered a map. Now I had to decide whether to follow it. I started by confronting the ledger of small silences that had been a constant in our home. It took a confrontation to make anything change, and confrontations don't come pre-packaged with clarity. I remember the day I walked into my mother's kitchen and asked the question that had stewed in me for years with a kind of weary patience. "Why did you keep the letters?" I asked. June was folding a dish towel, the rhythmic movement of folding an act of domestic assertion. She did not look up. "I thought it was kinder," she said, like someone who had rehearsed the line. "People talked, Olivia. I didn't want for you to be dragged through things." "Dragged through things," I repeated, the kitchen light making a sharp line along the sill. "June, you're talking about a person. A woman who loved me. You didn't want her to be involved, but you were involved. You met her. You decided what I could know." For a moment she closed her eyes. "Yes," she admitted. "I met her. It wasn't a pretty meeting. She was volatile. She begged. She said things that made me afraid for you." "What did she say?" I pressed. The question was my own kind of accusation, the kind that demanded raw truth. I needed specifics like a doctor needs vitals. June took a breath. "She said she would come back. She said she'd get help. But she also told stories of men and borrowing money and danger." She stopped as if the rest of the sentence had worn out on her tongue. "I couldn't let you be part of that story. And you decided that your version of safety was the only valid one," I said, feeling my own anger rise like heat. "You thought you'd cured the danger by erasing her existence from my life." "She would have hurt you," June said suddenly, and the ferocity in the words surprised me. "She would have made promises she couldn't keep. Sometimes love looks like difficult choices. Sometimes it looks like lying," I replied. The argument spiraled into a pattern I'd recognized all my life. An accused refusal and a defense that felt like pleading. We walked in circles, trading memories like coinage. Once, when I was small, June had told me that choosing me had been the hardest, most beautiful thing she had ever done. That narrative had been to her both crown and shield. Now I watched as it crumpled under the weight of truth. It was heartbreaking because it was not only her righteousness that was exposed, it was her fear. She had believed fear could protect me better than truth. There was one revealing moment when we both laughed, an absurd, exhausted laugh, and it made the kitchen feel smaller. "You should be grateful," she said softly, not as a command now but as a fragment of memory. "I know," I said. "But gratitude doesn't answer questions." My words felt taut as a violin string. June's lips trembled. "Do you hate me?" she asked. Hate is a big word, and it hovered between us like a loaded silence. I didn't say the word back. I didn't hate her. I grieved her. There is a difference. I was angry at the choices she had made, and that anger framed my grief. Grief felt like something that had been misplaced. "I don't know," I told her. "I don't know how to be both angry and grateful." We did not reconcile in that moment. There was no cinematic apology. Instead, there was a slow, mutual recalibration. June's defenses softened into tiredness. She started to send copies of old cards from time to time, small offerings like postcards smoothed by fingers that had once smoothed my hair. She would write, "Thinking of you," or "Take care," like petals thrown gently in my direction. I took them. I stored them in a new box, alongside the attic letters and a few received emails from relatives. The more I dug, the more I found evidence that June had been present in the conversation around my adoption for longer than she had let on. There were hospital records, redacted but legible in places, which indicated that a woman had been visited by someone named J. Montgomery. There were nurse notes that suggested the meeting had been tense. There was the witness testimony from a hospital orderly who remembered a woman with a soft voice and hard eyes, who had taken a baby and left quickly. The facts were not cinematic. They were human and messy. They were the kind of truth that offers more questions than closure. A pivotal moment came when I located a phone number associated with a social worker named Elaine, who had been on duty the day Hannah was discharged. She agreed to speak with me on the condition of anonymity. "I have no love for secrecy," she said, "but I have respect for the ways families survive." Her voice carried the kind of professional weariness that comes from holding people's lives. Your mother, June, she was terrified. She presented herself as stable. She had a husband with a good job. People make choices like that when they're afraid they'll lose their place. Did she bribe people? I asked without thinking. My mouth formulated the most dramatic accusations in the absence of clear answers. Not in the way movies make it, Elaine said. People exchange favors. Your mother had connections to a church and a social network. The hospital was overwhelmed. There are ways things happen quietly. She paused. I saw Hannah. She was always full of contradictions. She wasn't perfect. But there was a cruelty in how we sometimes sealed up the messy parts of people's lives. Learning these things did not relieve me. They complicated my understanding of culpability and motives. There was a lattice of decisions that included both June and a community that preferred tidy ends. Both could be right in their goals and wrong in their methods. The situation grew more fraught when I met someone who claimed to be outside of the original story but had been impacted by its aftershocks. His name was Daniel, a man in his late 40s who had grown up in Youngstown and who said he had been friends with the man who was my biological father for a time. He was blunt and not intentionally cruel. He had a way of saying things that made them sound like facts retrieved from a ledger. Your mother's choices served her well, he told me on a phone call that fell into the night. She kept up appearances. But there were consequences. Families get stitched together in ways that make other people disappear. Did my father? The question stuck behind the neutral wall of his voice. Did he want a relationship with me? Did he try? Daniel said nothing at first. There was a long pause, a kind of listening I could almost hear through the line. There were slips of regret, he said finally. But mostly there was disinterest. He wasn't a man built for responsibility. Hannah couldn't trust him. That doesn't absolve the way you were removed, but it shapes why things happened the way they did. As I stitched together the town's fragments, I began to imagine faces with more nuance than the stark dichotomy I had held. People are often both loving and cowardly. Courage and cowardice can exist in the same breath. The more nuance I allowed, the less I wanted to wield the truth as a weapon and the more I wanted it to be a foundation. But life does not relent simply because you learn facts. The emotional landscape is messy. There are debts to reckon with. June's refusal to be honest had cost her something intangible and yet vital. The ability to be fully known by the person she had raised. There are opportunities in life you only get once. The kind of raw, honest conversations you can have before time makes them impossible. June had chosen the safety of a particular story, and in doing so she had closed a door. I was not naive enough to believe that a final conversation would make everything right. But I also did not want to be someone who let resentment calcify into their bones. So I began to set boundaries. I told June I would no longer accept the phrase, "you should be grateful," as an answer to any direct question about my origins. I told her I needed to speak with people who had known Hannah and that I needed the autonomy to do so without being guilt. She bristled at first, as if I had insulted a family heirloom, but after that initial recoil there was motion toward compromise. She offered to bring over photo albums and to let me scan them. It was small and clumsy and human. When I finally arranged the meeting with my biological mother, everything felt both sacred and disturbingly ordinary. Hannah had been living several hours away, in a town that smelled of wood smoke and old newspapers. She agreed to meet in a park, and when I arrived I felt like someone stepping onto a stage where the script had been half improvised. The woman who approached me had hair shot with silver and eyes that, when she smiled, made the skin at the corners crinkle into places that looked like joy and sorrow braided together. She held my hands like a woman testing the texture of something she could scarcely believe was real. "Olivia," she said, and the name was a bell that seemed to ring in both of us. We talked for hours. She told me stories with a bluntness that was both tender and regrettable. She admitted to mistakes, long stretches of wanting to be better than circumstances allowed, and she also admitted to a love that had not been extinguished. "I wanted you," she said simply. "I wanted you in ways that hurt me." She promised details but also asked for the kind of forgiveness that cannot be requested as if it were owed. She said, "I hoped you'd come to me, but I also knew the world could be cruel." There were tears, of course. There were also moments of laughter that felt almost indecent because they rose so quickly from the brackish water we were wading through. We learned one another through story and memory, asking questions as if we were piecing together a mosaic from the shards of a broken vase. I learned that Hannah had not been a villain. She was, like everyone, a person who made choices from within a constrained set of options. She had loved me enough to leave me where someone would claim me. She had loved me enough to write letters even when no one read them. That we had both been loved by different women in different ways complicated my idea of loyalty and belonging. When I finally looked up from her face, the park had grown dim. The lights in the street lamps buzzed to life like distant promises. I felt like someone who had been given a long overdue and very complicated gift. I also felt, with fierce clarity, that my mother had lost something she could not buy back: the right to be the sole author of my story. She had thought her decision would simplify things, but instead it had complicated her own relationship with me. She didn't see what she was losing by demanding that gratitude be the currency of our connection. She was losing the opportunity to learn from the person she had raised, to hear my anger and my questions as the seeds of something richer. Walking out of the park after that first meeting with Hannah, the night air felt both clean and terribly exposed. I had expected a tidy closure or an explosive rupture, some cinematic end that would make for a neat story, yet life kept insisting on being stubbornly ordinary. I returned to my mother's house with a weight that was not simple. It was complex and knotty. It required decisions that didn't fit into the categories of right or wrong. I tried to bring my mother and Hannah together at first, thinking a meeting might make everything humane. June's initial reaction was a study in old rehearsed lines. "No," she said in a voice that had the brittle edge of someone protecting what was hers. "I don't want a scene." That word, scene, made me wonder whether she viewed every honest exchange as theatrical, a threat to decorum. The first time Hannah and I tried a mediated meeting, June sent me a text. "If you see her, remember where you came from." It stung in a way that felt old and unhealed. The mediation was awkward, with both of them circling the conversation like wary animals. June kept her sentences short. Hannah's vocabulary was raw. There were moments when they both cried, but the tears felt like different currencies. One paid for stability, the other for a rougher kind of truth. They never achieved reconciliation in the way I'd hoped. What they did instead was make visible the fracture lines. In the months after those meetings, I noticed a softening in my mother occasionally, as if her edges had been sanded by the recentness of our conversations. There were days when she called without panic in her voice, asking about my work or telling me about a recipe she'd tried. Other days she reverted to the old language of gratitude, as if it were a comfort. "You should be grateful," she'd say in the half-joke that had always been partly true and partly weapon. I found myself less willing to accept that blanket statement as an answer. It became, instead, a prompt for further conversation. Grateful for what? I'd ask. Grateful to be chosen by whom and why? The escalation that changed everything, however, wasn't argumentative. It was a medical diagnosis. June's neurologist told us, after a battery of tests, that she had the early stages of frontotemporal dementia. It was the kind of diagnosis that unfolds slowly and leaves everyone unmoored. She was 30 years older than me, and yet suddenly the chronology accelerated. For weeks, I vacillated between scientific curiosity and gutting fear. Watching someone you love lose pieces of themselves is a unique kind of grief, one that starts before the death and occupies the slow time between now and the eventual finality. I do not wish to romanticize what dementia did to the stories in our house. June began to forget things that were once her armor. Names, whether she'd had lunch, whether she had locked the back door. There were moments of crystalline clarity when she would look at me and say something unbearably tender and specific. And then, in the next hour, a sentence like, "You should be grateful," would slip from her mouth with the same automatic certainty as a prayer. Those moments made me more patient and more furious at once. You can love someone and resent the way they once manipulated you. The two feelings do not cancel one another out. One night, when the rain had been hammering the gutters for hours and the house smelled like ozone and boiled cabbage, June was lucid enough to ask me a question that felt like the hinge of our relationship. "Do you think you can forgive me?" she asked, her hands clasped like someone praying. I sat down opposite her and felt my own breath catch. "June," I began, "forgiveness is complicated. I don't know if forgiveness is the right word. I need honesty. I need to be known. Part of why I am angry is because you tried to write my life without asking me how I wanted it told." She looked at me then with an expression that was stripped of defense, only the tiredness of someone who had been authoring their life to avoid being judged. "I was scared," she said. "I didn't want you to be hurt by the town, by pity. Her voice trailed. "I know," I said. "But fear doesn't justify erasing someone else." Saying it out loud did something to the room. It was an intervention, a small incantation of truth. She reached for my hand, and in that touch I felt both the ordinary love of the woman who had raised me and the limitation of a love that had been protective to a degree that shadowed off into control. Over the following months, as June's memory deteriorated, the idea of being chosen became eerily literal. She would reach for the phrase, "You should be grateful," like an incantation against the chaos of forgetfulness. It was as if the story she had told herself anchored her amid the present uncertainty. She clung to being the woman who had chosen me because it gave her a narrative identity she could still recall. Her decline was not cinematic, it was bureaucratic and mundane. Missed medication, a cancelled appointment, a hospital interval after a fall. There were moments when she did not recognize me and said my name like a stranger's. Those times broke me open. There is an intimate cruelty to watching someone you love vanish bit by bit into a state where they cannot be held accountable for their past actions in the way the living often are. You find yourself wanting to make them small gestures of tenderness, even if they once made you keep smallings of your own. It does not absolve them, but it complicates your feelings in ways that are both humane and morally challenging. I became, practically overnight, one of her primary caregivers. It was a role I took on with a complicated mix of resentment and duty. I organized her medications, sat with her while she tried to remember the plot of a book she had read 20 years ago, and watched old videos we had made when I was a child, where she smiled at camera with the same practiced contentment. At night I would lie awake and think about the consequences of a life that demands gratitude. June had wanted my loyalty in exchange for the stability she'd provided. Now her mind, untampered by the vanity of certainty, required compassion that sometimes felt undeserved. The hardest day, the day that rewired the axis of my emotions, was the one in which she, in a rare moment of clarity, took both my hands and said to me, "You should be grateful to be chosen." And then, as if the words had a second movement, she added softer, "And I'm sorry I took your story." I didn't expect that confession. It landed in me like a stone in a pond, ripples of something settling. She did not materially say why she had done it. It was still wrapped in fear and poor choices. But the apology shifted the calculus. It didn't undo the past, but it allowed me to see that at least part of her decision to silence Hannah had come from a place of terror, not malice. It allowed me to see the humanity in her cowardice. I thought about the woman in the picture with my eyes, Hannah, about the ribbon she tied back and the cigarettes she hid. I thought about Marta and the neighbor who had always remembered that Hannah loved in ways that bled through her mistakes. The world is messy. It contains both unlovable acts and love that refuses to be annihilated. My mother had not meant to ruin me, but she had meant to protect herself at my expense. Her apology, even if late and incomplete, asked me to make a moral decision about how to proceed. What I learned in that time was not a tidy moral. It was the complicated knowledge that people can be both cruel and tender. That holding someone accountable and caring for them are not mutually exclusive. That you can love someone and also set limits for their behavior. When my mother finally left this world, not abruptly but in the steady, sad decline of dementia, there was no cinematic crescendo. There was a hospital bed, a hospice nurse's soft efficiency, and family that navigated grief with small rituals. Songs, photographs, a reading of something she had loved. At the funeral, people said, she was brave. And she was a good mother, in ways that made me want to shout corrections into the wind. But I didn't. I let the praise roll over me and collected the parts of her that were true, a woman who at times had been fiercely protective and at others fear-run. I stood at the edge of the graveside service and realized that the thing my mother had not seen she would never be able to see again. That gratitude cannot be bought with silence. She had been so determined to secure a life for me that she had failed to understand that the cost was intimacy. If you've been moved by this, a simple like helps others find stories like this. And if you have experiences like mine, please share them. Somewhere, someone might find courage in your words. The days after June's funeral were a kind of slow disassembling. Her house felt too quiet, the frames on the wall suddenly accusing in their permanence. I found myself sorting through items that felt like decisions. Which photos to keep, which letters to preserve, what to do with the box of attic letters that had started this whole sequence of events. I realized that a life is an accumulation of things and stories, and for someone who had felt defined by the phrase, "You should be grateful," I had to decide how to rearrange my life story without letting it be dictated again. The first practical decision I made was to continue seeing Hannah. I wanted her to be a part of my life not as an act of defiance but as a choice rooted in honesty. We built rituals, Sunday dinners, walks through a park where she taught me to listen for the particular songs birds sang in the morning. We traveled once to the place she'd lived when she wrote me those first letters. Standing there, the wind off the river felt like an argument that had been settled with the cut of a knife. Raw, sharp, and oddly clarifying. Hannah and I, in the way that people who have been separated for decades do, began to relearn each other. Part of what felt like an education was the understanding of the kinds of love that don't translate easily into the language of gratitude. She had loved me in a spare, complicated way, sometimes absent, sometimes creating situations less than ideal, but always in a way that left a trace bigger than the mistakes she had made. We were both rebuilding a relationship on new terms. Terms that allowed for anger and forgiveness to exist without being conflated into a single tidy lesson. When I organized June's papers, I found the original adoption agreement. My hands trembled as I read the legalese. It described what the court allowed and what was binding. There were signatures that read like seals on a contract that had governed more than property. It had governed narratives. I learned that sometimes institutions formalize stories people have already told. Stories that cause pain precisely because they are made lawful. That realization made me angry. It also made me feel oddly liberated. Laws can be changed. Narratives can be rewritten. The lesson that stayed with me most stubbornly was this. Gratitude cannot be demanded or used as a currency to silence legitimate questions. Being chosen does not confer moral license to erase other people's claims. But being chosen is not, either, a simple gift. It's an event with consequences, obligations, and paradoxes. You can be grateful for the warmth the home provides and still want answers about your origins. This is not disloyalty. It's wholeness. I also learned that families are not static. They are arrangements of people who negotiate each other's boundaries. My mother's choice to hide letters and to frame me as chosen was a choice made in a cultural context that favored neatness over complexity. She'd wanted me to be safe by the standards she valued. In refusing to accept that framing, I did not revoke her motherhood. I reframed it. I stopped allowing the phrase, "you should be grateful," to be used as a shield for evading conversation. I gave myself permission to hold both gratitude and critique simultaneously. There were difficult conversations with Luke, my adoptive brother, who had been close to our mother and who sometimes resented my insistence on airing what he called family business. We did not resolve everything in the way novels resolve conflicts, but we found new rhythms. He came to one of my readings where I read an essay about memory and obligation, sat in the third row, and afterwards he hugged me as if we had both done something brave. He said, "I didn't always understand why you did what you did, Liv. But I'm glad you did." It was small. A domestic repair that felt genuine. One of the last things I did was write a letter to my mother's memory. I told her that I forgave her in some ways and that I mourned the things we would never say to one another. I told her that telling my story was not vengeance but survival. I told her I loved her in a recognizing, complicated way. It didn't make me less angry, but it made me more free. If this story resonates and you'd like to hear more, don't forget to subscribe. There's more to come about the messy ways we find ourselves. As I moved forward, I kept the letters from the attic and the new ones from Hannah. I catalogued them, not to inventory pain, but to create an archive of truth. I started a small community group in Portland for adoptees seeking contact, an awkward assemblage of people who wanted both to be heard and to hear. We shared our stories, the anger, the tenderness, the bureaucratic absurdities that shaped people's lives. There were no simple moral lessons in those meetings, only the grit of humanity. The final thing I learned was about control, and how desperately people try to keep it. My mother had tried to control the story of my life because it offered her a certain safety. She didn't see what she was losing: my capacity to be a whole person who could ask questions without being shamed. She couldn't see that by insisting on gratitude as my only acceptable response, she was losing the chance to be my confidant, my critic, my fellow traveler. Her decision to buy security through silence cost her the possibility of deeper intimacy with me. I don't say this to blame her wholly. I say it as an observation about human fear and the way it can shape us into people who cause the suffering we once feared. Sitting now at my kitchen table, the rain a gentle percussion on the roof, I can hear my mother's voice in the cadence of my own when I talk to students about the ethics of literature, about how we owe each other stories told with clarity and compassion. I teach kids to ask complicated questions. I teach them that gratitude can be authentic and that it can also be coerced. I tell them that real love is messy and sometimes painful, but it should never demand silence. If any of this has touched you, please leave a comment. Has something like this ever happened to you? I'm reading everything. In the end, the thing that I could not give my mother was her wish to control the narrative. She lost the ability to be the sole author of my story when I answered the letters in the attic and found a life beyond gratitude's narrow mandate. She didn't see what she was losing when she said, with the same certainty she'd used for decades, "You should be grateful to be chosen." What she lost was the chance to be fully known by the person she had spent a lifetime raising. And perhaps, in losing that, she gained something as well: an opportunity to be remembered as a human being who was both flawed and love-giving, someone I had to learn to forgive without forgetting. My life now is not a tidy narrative of reconciliation or condemnation. It's a complicated portrait, a woman who teaches, who loves, who remembers the cost of being grateful when gratitude was demanded. It's also a story about choosing the hard openness of truth over the comfort of silence. In the quiet moments, when the rain presses against the windows, I open the box of letters and, with hands that tremble in ways they'll never tell, I read them aloud, sometimes to myself, sometimes to a room of people who have also been asked to be grateful. We listen and we learn. That has been enough to make the losses bearable and to let the story, finally, be our own.